Emily, a devoted wife and mother, is woken one night by a call from her husband's secretary, who tearfully reports that her husband David has been in a car accident. In a panic, Emily races to the hospital, only to witness a gut-wrenching scene. David, very much unharmed, in the arms of his young secretary, Claire. They are kissing. That moment shatters the facade of Emily's seemingly perfect marriage. But this isn't just about betrayal, it's about secrets buried for years. As Emily pulls away from David and begins uncovering the truth, what unfolds is a layered tale of deception, emotional manipulation, and a powerful reckoning. Through pain, Emily finds strength. Through devastation, she rediscovers herself. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the wooden floor beneath the heating vents. Emily stirred in her sleep, tangled in a nest of sheets, unaware that her world was about to shift. The ringing phone pierced the stillness. She blinked against the darkness, reached for her cell on the nightstand, and squinted at the screen. Claire Johnson, her husband's secretary. It was 12:17 a.m. Emily sat up, heart tightening. She hesitated. What kind of call came at midnight? With fingers trembling slightly, she answered. Hello? Mrs. Walker? Claire's voice was frantic, laced with tears. It's David. He was in an accident, a car crash. I'm so sorry. Emily didn't wait to hear more. She was out of bed, phone clutched to her chest, moving on instinct. Thoughts collided. Was he okay? Where was he? Why was Claire the one calling? 10 minutes later, she was in the car, keys shaking in the ignition. The night air was heavy, cold. The roads were nearly empty, the city asleep. Her mind raced faster than the car, memories flashing of David's kiss before bed, the way he touched her shoulder absent-mindedly while brushing past, the slight distance she'd been noticing for months but couldn't name. None of it made sense now. She pulled into the hospital parking lot, her stomach a knot of dread. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she approached the front desk. A nurse directed her down the hallway. He's in exam room 6. He's not hurt badly, she added gently, but Emily was already halfway there. The door to the exam room was ajar. Emily stepped forward and stopped cold. Inside, David sat on the edge of the bed, a small scrape on his forehead, his shirt untucked. Claire stood between his knees, her face buried in his neck. He whispered something, soft, too soft to hear. Then he lifted her chin and kissed her. It wasn't a peck. It wasn't a mistake. It was familiar, intimate, like they'd done it 100 times before. For a second, Emily couldn't breathe. Her legs felt numb, her hands ice. Then something hot surged through her. Rage, betrayal, heartbreak, all twisted into a single visceral reaction. She pushed the door wide open. They froze. Claire stepped back. David paled. Emily! But she didn't let him speak. She walked straight to Claire and slapped her across the face so hard the sound cracked through the sterile room. Claire stumbled sideways, hand to her cheek, eyes wide with shock. Then Emily turned to David. Her voice came out low and cold. You can rot here, David. Don't come home. And she walked out without looking back. The door clicked shut behind her, but inside her, something else had burst wide open, a wound she hadn't even known existed until it was ripped apart. Emily walked briskly down the hallway, her heels tapping the linoleum like a ticking clock counting down to an emotional implosion. Her face was a mask, stone cold, but her chest felt like it was caving in. Her hands were trembling, her breath uneven. She didn't remember passing the reception desk, didn't register the nurse calling after her. Everything around her had blurred, muffled by the storm roaring in her mind. Outside, the night was colder than before. A sharp wind cut across the parking lot, but she didn't feel it. She stood still, keys clenched in her fist, eyes staring blankly at her car. The image kept replaying. The kiss, David's hand on Claire's back, their bodies too close, too comfortable. It hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been confusion. It had been love, or something like it, and that terrified her more than the betrayal itself. How long? The question repeated like a drumbeat. How long had he been lying to her? How many nights had he left early for late meetings that were never about work? And how many times had she kissed him goodbye, completely blind to the truth? She sat in the driver's seat, but didn't start the engine. Her hands dropped to her lap. The weight of what she saw began to crush her. She had slapped Claire, yes, but the real wound wasn't on Claire's face. It was inside Emily, swelling beneath her ribs. She rested her forehead on the steering wheel, trying to breathe, trying to find the strength not to scream. A couple walked past her car, laughing softly, probably coming from a late movie or a nearby diner. The sound cut through her like glass. How could the world keep moving when hers had collapsed? She stayed there for nearly 20 minutes. No tears came. Not yet. Only the silence. Only the heavy, suffocating silence. When she finally drove home, the sky had started to lighten. Dawn was crawling in from the edges of night. Her street was still and dark. She parked in the driveway, turned off the engine, and just stared at the house they had built together. The porch light was still on. A sweater of David's hung on the back of the front door, right where she'd last seen him leave it. The children were asleep upstairs. Their innocent faces would know nothing of what happened tonight. Not yet. She would protect them from this. For now. But how long could she carry the secret alone? Inside the house, she walked into the living room and sank onto the couch. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't need to look. It would be David, or maybe Claire, trying to explain, trying to twist the truth. She turned the phone over and powered it off. Emily pulled the throw blanket over her lap and sat still. She felt hollow, like someone had scooped out her insides and left only the shell. But beneath the silence, something was starting to rise in her. Not anger, not yet. Not sorrow either. It was awareness. The first piercing realization that everything she thought she knew about her husband might have been a lie, and that this betrayal, this moment, was only the beginning. The morning light filtered through the living room curtains, casting soft lines across Emily's face. She hadn't slept. Her eyes were dry, not from lack of tears, but because the tears never came. Something inside her refused to fall apart completely. Not yet. Not in the quiet hours when the house still felt like a lie. Upstairs, the faint thump of little feet stirred her back into reality. Her daughter Lily, 6 years old, always woke first. A few seconds later, the pitter-patter of socks on wood floor reached the stairs. Emily sat up and wiped her face. Not because she had cried, but because she knew she needed to put on a mask. Lily peeked around the corner, hair tousled, dragging her blanket behind her. "Mommy?" Emily smiled faintly, the kind of smile you wear for your child, even when your world has just collapsed. "Hey, sweet pea." Lily crawled onto the couch beside her and curled up. "Why are you up so early?" "I just couldn't sleep." "Me neither." She rested her head on Emily's arm. "I had a bad dream." Emily stroked her daughter's hair, the warmth of her presence both grounding and cruel. What would she say when Lily eventually asked why Daddy wasn't home? How would she explain something so adult, so broken, in a language a child could understand? After Lily went to the kitchen in search of cereal, Emily finally stood. Her legs were stiff, her body sore, but she moved as if on autopilot. She made coffee, poured milk, packed lunch for her son, Michael, who would be down any minute. Every movement was mechanical, just enough to keep things from unraveling. But the moment the front door closed behind them, Michael with his backpack, Lily with her lunchbox, Emily stood in the hallway, alone again. And this time, there was no reason left to hold anything back. She slid to the floor, The first sob came out like a cough, raw and sudden. Then the next, and the next. They weren't dainty tears. They were full-bodied cries, the kind that shook her shoulders and twisted her lungs. She clutched her chest, curled into herself, and let the grief come. This wasn't just about a kiss. It wasn't even just about David. It was everything. Years of sacrifice, of loyalty, of building a life around someone she thought was her partner. All of it now hanging by threads she hadn't realized were fraying until they snapped. She cried until her throat hurt, until her face was blotchy and her breath came in short, sharp gasps. Her hands dug into the fabric of her clothes as if bracing herself from falling deeper. Eventually she lay still, curled on the hardwood floor, staring at the ceiling through tear-blurred eyes. The sobbing had stopped, but the ache remained. It had moved lower now, settling into her bones. What haunted her most wasn't just the betrayal. It was the clarity that followed it. Everything had changed, and there would be no going back. Not to the woman she was yesterday, not to the man she thought she knew, and certainly not to the marriage that now felt like a story told to someone else. By the time the front door creaked open late that evening, the house was still. The children were upstairs, bathed and tucked in, their soft breathing muffled behind closed doors. Emily sat in the armchair near the cold fireplace, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had been waiting, not for reconciliation, but for the confrontation she knew was inevitable. David stepped inside quietly, like a man entering someone else's home. His face was pale, his clothes wrinkled, and there was a small bandage on his forehead where Claire had said he'd been hurt. He looked exhausted, but Emily didn't care. She didn't rise. She didn't speak. He stood just inside the doorway, hesitant. "Emily," he said, voice low, almost pleading. "Can we talk?" She studied him for a moment, her eyes unreadable. "You mean now that you're finished with her?" His expression twisted. "It's not what you think." Her voice remained calm, too calm. "Then explain it. Explain the kiss. Explain why your secretary was the one to call me. Explain why you weren't even surprised to see me standing there." David took a step forward. "We didn't mean for it to happen. It got out of control." Emily laughed, cold, brittle, humorless. "You make it sound like a fire or a flood, something that just swept you up." He ran a hand through his hair. "I didn't want you to find out like that. You didn't want me to find out at all." Silence settled again, heavy between them. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he added quietly. "But you did." David looked down at his feet. "I've made mistakes. I know I've ruined things. But I love you, Emily. That hasn't changed." Emily stood now slowly and walked toward him. For a moment, David's shoulders lifted as if he believed she might reach for him. But she stopped several feet away, her eyes hard. "Don't say you love me. Not after what you did. Love doesn't lie. Love doesn't sneak around and kiss someone else at midnight while your wife is driving through the dark thinking you're dead." He flinched. She continued, voice steady but sharp. "You cheated, David. Not just on me. On our home, on our children. On every promise you ever made." He opened his mouth, but she held up a hand. "Don't apologize. Not now. Not until you're ready to be honest. Completely." David looked at her for a long moment, and in that stillness, something between them cracked, subtle but irreversible. Finally, he nodded. "I'll stay at a hotel tonight." She didn't stop him, didn't ask where or with whom. She simply turned and walked away, up the stairs, her spine straight, her hands shaking behind her back. In their bedroom, she sat on the edge of the bed, eyes fixed on the door he didn't walk through. The mattress felt too wide, the silence too loud. But for the first time since the call, she felt something else beneath the sorrow. Control. David had broken her trust, but he hadn't broken her will. Not yet. And as she lay back on the bed alone, Emily realized she wasn't waiting for him to come back. She was waiting to decide if she wanted him to at all. The next morning, Emily awoke not to sunlight or silence, but to the sound of Lily humming in the hallway. A soft, off-key melody, full of innocence. It reminded Emily of something she used to hum as a girl before life became a careful balancing act between keeping things together and pretending nothing was broken. She sat up, the sheets cool against her skin. David's side of the bed was untouched. She didn't miss his presence, but she did feel the absence. The way one notices a missing picture frame or a door that used to creak but now stays still. Downstairs, she moved like clockwork again. Toast in the toaster, fruit sliced, lunches packed. The ritual was oddly comforting, a rhythm she could control, but the ache beneath it all remained. Low, constant, like a bruise you forget until something brushes against it. Michael, her 10-year-old, entered the kitchen with sleep still clinging to his eyes. "Is Dad still at work?" he asked casually, pouring cereal. Emily didn't flinch. She had been bracing for the question. "He's away for a few days," she said, her voice even. "Some business stuff came up." Michael nodded, unconcerned. He never questioned his father's absences. He had grown used to them, as had she. That realization landed heavily. Later, as she tied Lily's shoes near the doorway, the little girl asked, "Will Daddy read to me tonight when he gets home?" Emily froze. Her hands paused at the laces, her head bowed just enough to hide her face. She lifted her eyes to meet her daughter's. "Not tonight, sweetheart. Tomorrow? We'll see." It was all she could offer, all she could manage without choking on the truth. She walked them to school herself, holding both their hands a little tighter than usual. She smiled at the crossing guard, chatted briefly with another parent, all the while keeping the pain hidden behind a practiced calm. She was shielding her children, not just from the betrayal, but from the storm that had started to form inside her. Back at home, the house felt cavernous, quiet. She wandered into the laundry room and stood there, staring at the clothes in the hamper. One of David's dress shirts lay on top, crumpled. She picked it up, smelled it, faint cologne, his usual scent, but it felt like someone else's now. She tossed it into the washer and pressed start. Later, she took out the family photo album. Page after page, memories smiled back at her. David with the kids at the beach, her and David on their anniversary, wine glasses raised, birthday cakes, holidays, small moments that now felt staged or worse, hollow. Had he been cheating then? Was she smiling beside a stranger? Her phone lit up on the coffee table. A message from David. "I'm sorry. I want to talk. Please let me come by after work." She stared at the screen but didn't reply. Instead, she went upstairs to Lily's room and sat on the floor. Surrounded by dolls and crayon drawings, Emily began sorting through old clothes, old toys, anything to keep her hands busy, anything to keep her from breaking again. This was how she would survive, she realized. Not with revenge, not with anger, but with structure, with care, with the unshakable instinct to protect her children from a truth they were too young to carry. Because even though her marriage might be shattering, she would not let her children see her fall apart. She was still their mother, and that was the one role she refused to fail. 3 days passed. David stayed silent, at least in person. His texts came once or twice a day, carefully worded, polite, remorseful. Emily read them but never replied. She wasn't ready to talk, and certainly not ready to forgive. She needed space, time, clarity. Then on a Thursday afternoon, while she was sorting the mail, she found it. A plain white envelope with no return address, just her name in a delicate slanted script. Emily Walker. Her fingers stilled. For a moment, she just stared at it. Something about the handwriting felt familiar. Too neat, too deliberate. She opened it slowly, unfolded the single sheet of stationery inside, and saw the name signed at the bottom, Claire Johnson. Her chest tightened, but she forced herself to read. Dear Emily, I debated for days whether I should write this. I know you don't want to hear from me, and I wouldn't blame you if you burned this letter the moment you recognize my handwriting, but I'm writing anyway, not to justify what I've done, but because you deserve the truth, even if it doesn't come from the person who should have told you first. What happened between David and me didn't begin that night at the hospital. It began months ago, maybe longer. I wish I could say I didn't mean for it to happen, but that would be a lie. I knew what I was doing. And so did he. He told me things. Things about your marriage, about how distant you two had become. He said he felt invisible at home, that you didn't see him anymore. I believed him. I let myself believe I was helping him feel alive again, that I was giving him something he was missing. I see now how pathetic that sounds. But there's more. I didn't just fall in love with David. I fell into a version of him he wanted me to see. He was charming, wounded, attentive. I never questioned why a married man would whisper the things he did, or why he always made me feel like I was saving him. I wanted to matter to him so badly, I ignored the obvious. He was already someone else's. He promised me things, that he'd leave you, that we'd start over. I waited and waited, but he never followed through. When the accident happened, I thought maybe this was the moment he'd choose me. That's why I was with him at the hospital. That's why I kissed him. But when I saw your face in that doorway, everything changed. I saw who he really belonged to, not just because of marriage or children, but because the look in your eyes was nothing like mine. Yours held betrayal. Mine held foolish hope. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know this. You were not the weak one in this story. I was, and so was he. Claire. Emily read the letter once. Then again. Her fingers were tight around the paper, her breath shallow. She sat down at the kitchen table, the letter lying between her hands like a loaded weapon. The words burned, but not because of their malice. In fact, the letter wasn't cruel. It was devastating because it was honest. Claire wasn't just a young secretary caught in a fling. She had been drawn in by David's curated stories, by a narrative that made him the victim, Emily the villain, and Claire the savior. It was manipulative, calculated, and worst of all, it was something Emily had seen coming, deep down, but had never dared to name. She thought of all the quiet dinners, the missed calls, the distracted gazes. She had blamed herself for those silences, blamed herself for not being more exciting, more affectionate, more something. But now she saw it for what it was. David hadn't strayed because she had failed. He had strayed because he needed someone to validate his emptiness. And Claire had been the easiest mirror. Emily folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. She didn't tear it up. She didn't scream. She simply stared out the kitchen window, the late afternoon sun flickering between the trees, and felt something shift. Not closure, not yet, but clarity. And that, for the first time in days, felt like power. That night, after the children were asleep and the house had settled into its usual hush, Emily sat alone in her bedroom, the letter from Claire still tucked beneath her nightstand drawer. She hadn't read it again, but it haunted her. Not because it hurt, but because it made her ask questions she had been avoiding for years. She pulled an old shoebox down from the top of her closet. Dust clung to the edges. Inside were pieces of a different life, photographs from college, postcards from her backpacking trip through the Southwest, a half-finished manuscript she once dreamed would become a novel. There was even a concert ticket stub from a band she used to love. Before early morning feedings, parent-teacher conferences, and the quiet, relentless weight of being needed all the time. She sat cross-legged on the bed, flipping through the fragments. In one photo, she was smiling with her whole face, eyes squinting into the sun. Her hair was messy, wild. Her arms wrapped around a canvas bag and a notebook filled with poems she never shared. That woman felt like a stranger, but not quite. The truth settled heavily on her chest. She had disappeared. Not all at once. It had been gradual, like water eroding a shoreline. She had folded herself around David's life, his career, his dreams. When he wanted to move across states for a promotion, she agreed. When he suggested staying home full-time with the kids, she nodded, despite the quiet ache she felt packing up her office. She had been so busy building a family that she forgot she was still allowed to be her own person. And what hurt most wasn't that David had betrayed her. It was that, somewhere along the way, she had betrayed herself. Not out of weakness, out of love, out of duty, out of the quiet lie women are taught, that good wives keep things together, no matter the cost. Emily exhaled, long and low. She got up, went to the bathroom, and looked at herself in the mirror. She didn't look broken. She looked tired, yes. But behind the exhaustion was something sharper, something awake. She opened the drawer beneath the sink and pulled out the lipstick she hadn't worn in months. Maybe longer, a deep red, bold. She traced it across her lips, not for anyone else, not for a night out, but for herself. Then she picked up her phone, not to call David, not to respond to his unread messages, but to message her old friend, Carla, the one who ran a weekend writing group Emily used to attend before the kids, before the chaos, before she became invisible to herself. "Hey, is your group still meeting?" The reply came faster than expected. "Every Saturday, we'd love to have you back." Emily smiled, just barely. It wasn't much, but it was a start, because she didn't just want to survive this. She wanted to find the woman she used to be, the woman who believed in words and sunsets and the freedom of her own mind. That woman wasn't gone. She was just waiting. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the kitchen counter as Emily poured herself a cup of coffee. The house was unusually still. Lily was at a friend's for a sleepover, and Michael had left early for soccer practice. It was the first morning in weeks she'd been truly alone. She didn't plan to revisit the past. But when she opened the hallway closet to grab an old box of winter coats, her hand brushed against a familiar binder, David's archive of business receipts and travel itineraries. The moment she saw it, something inside her stilled. For years, she had filed away his paperwork without a second thought. Hotel bookings, flight confirmations, expense reports, all routine, all boring. But now, with new eyes and raw suspicion, Emily sat cross-legged in the hallway, flipping through the binder page by page. At first, nothing jumped out. But then came the dates. A hotel stay in Seattle, 3 nights, when David had told her he was in Chicago for a trade show. A restaurant receipt in Boston with a dinner for 2, dated Valentine's Day last year. Her stomach clenched. She opened her laptop and pulled up their old calendar, syncing the dates. One by one, she matched them to times he'd claimed to be elsewhere. Conferences, late-night meetings, quick business trips. The evidence mounted, quiet and damning. What gutted her wasn't just the betrayal. It was how ordinary it all seemed. Neat rows of transactions, business cards from hotel concierge, wine bars, floral shops. It was also methodical. Had he planned it like this from the beginning? Had she been so easy to fool? She found herself digging deeper, opening drawers, unzipping luggage he hadn't touched in months. Inside a side pocket of his old duffel bag, she found a gold bracelet, dainty, elegant, not hers. Tucked beside it was a small note in Claire's handwriting. "For your next trip, I miss you already." Emily sat back, the bracelet dangling loosely in her fingers. Her heart didn't race. It didn't even hurt. It was like finding the final puzzle piece to a picture she no longer wished to see. This wasn't one affair. It had been a pattern, a secret second life. and she had been edited out of it entirely. She stood and went to the bedroom, placed the bracelet on David's pillow, and closed the door behind her. Later that day, she opened her journal for the first time in years. The pages smelled faintly of dust and old ink. She wrote slowly, carefully, not about David, not about Claire, but about herself, about the dreams she had once penned, the voice she had silenced, the years she had traded for a version of love that turned out to be an illusion. She filled 5 pages without pausing. Writing didn't fix anything, but it reminded her that she was still here, still capable of telling her own story. Not the version that revolved around David, not the version written out in hotel bills and secret trysts. Her version, the honest one. That night, as she curled beneath the blanket with a book instead of a man, Emily felt the weight of clarity settle over her, not as a burden, but as armor. She wasn't confused anymore, and she would never again be blind. Saturday came with heavy gray skies and the scent of rain in the air. Emily had planned to spend the morning at the writing group, but she canceled at the last minute. Something else had taken root in her chest, something that wouldn't let go until she faced it. Claire. The name alone used to ignite rage, but now it was something else. Not sympathy, not forgiveness, but a need for closure. The letter had opened a door that could no longer be shut. Emily needed to look her in the eye. Not for revenge, not for a scene, but for the truth that could only come face to face. She found Claire's address buried deep in David's phone bill records. It was a modest apartment complex across town. Emily parked outside and sat in the car for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel. Part of her questioned why she was here, but the rest of her already knew. Some wounds don't heal until you understand how they were made. When Claire opened the door, her eyes widened in surprise. She looked younger than Emily remembered, barefoot, her hair damp as if she just showered. She hesitated, then stepped back. "You came," she said quietly. Emily nodded and walked in. The apartment was simple, sparse furniture, soft lighting, a faint smell of lavender and coffee. It felt lived in, but temporary, like someone waiting to leave. They sat opposite each other at the kitchen table. "I'm not here to fight," Emily began. "I didn't think you were," Claire replied, her voice tight with restraint. There was a long silence before Emily spoke again. "You said in your letter that he made promises to you, that he made you believe he'd leave me." Claire looked away. "He did. More than once. Did you believe him?" Claire's answer was slow, deliberate. "At first, no. I told myself I was smarter than that. But he had a way of making you feel like you were the only person who ever really understood him. Like you were saving him from something he couldn't name. It was addicting." Emily didn't respond right away. She knew that version of David. She'd met him years ago, in their early 20s, before the kids and the mortgage and the disappointments. Back when he still needed her more than he resented her. Back when she still saw him clearly. "Was it love?" Emily asked quietly. Claire didn't answer right away. Her eyes filled, not with drama, but something heavier, shame. "I thought it was. I really did. But now, I don't know. Maybe I just wanted to matter." Emily felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected. Sadness. Not for Claire, not exactly, but for how many women, herself included, had been sold a version of love that required disappearing to earn it. "I don't blame you for everything," Emily said finally. "You're not the only one who made choices, but you knew he had a family. You knew about me." Claire nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "And I hated myself for it every day, but I couldn't stop. I wanted to be chosen." Emily stood slowly. "You were, for a while, but it was never going to last." Claire didn't argue. At the door, Emily turned back. "He's good at lying. To others. To himself. But don't let that be the story you carry. Claire looked up, eyes red. I won't. Outside, the rain had started to fall. Soft, steady. Emily walked back to her car without hurrying. She felt lighter, though nothing had truly changed. The betrayal was still real. The marriage was still broken. But something had shifted. She had looked into the eyes of the woman who helped destroy her world, and she hadn't crumbled. She hadn't screamed or cried. She had stood in the ruins and seen clearly, for the first time in years, that her worth was never tied to the choices David made or the lies he told. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was awake. Sunday morning came with a strange calm. The kids were at their grandparents' for the weekend, and the house, for once, was still. No cartoons, no spilled cereal, no hurried packing of backpacks. Emily moved through the silence like it was sacred. She stood by the window, watching the trees bend in the wind. When the knock came at the door, she already knew who it was. She didn't hesitate to open it. David stood there, looking smaller than she remembered. His hair was uncombed, his shoulders drawn in as if preparing to carry blame. He didn't ask if he could come in. He just looked at her and said, I think I'm finally ready to tell you the truth. She stepped aside. In the living room, he sat on the edge of the couch while she took the armchair across from him. No pleasantries, no small talk. The air between them was thick, but not with tension, more like a weight that had waited too long to fall. He looked at the floor when he began. It wasn't just Claire. There were others. Emily didn't move. She had suspected, but hearing it aloud still felt like a punch. David continued, his voice uneven. It started about 4 years ago. The first time was during a business trip. I didn't plan it. It just happened. At least that's what I told myself. But the truth is, I was angry. At life. At you. At myself. She held his gaze unblinking. Angry at me? He nodded, shame crawling across his face. You were always so steady, always doing the right thing. You took care of the kids, the house, everything. And I started to feel useless, like I didn't matter anymore, like you didn't need me. Emily let out a bitter laugh. So you punished me by lying, by finding women who would make you feel needed? David looked down again. I think I needed to feel like I had power over something. My job was stressful. Our marriage, it felt like a routine. I didn't know how to talk to you anymore, and instead of trying, I just escaped. She folded her arms, her voice quiet but sharp. You know I would have listened. You know I've stood by you through every failure, every mood swing, every night you came home late. He nodded. I know. That's what makes it worse. There it was, the raw, bleeding truth. Not just that he cheated, but that he chose to, again and again. Not because she failed him, but because he couldn't face his own emptiness. I kept thinking I'd stop, he said, that the guilt would force me to be better, but it didn't. I got good at hiding things. I convinced myself that as long as you didn't know, I wasn't really hurting you. You weren't just hurting me, Emily said quietly. You were destroying the version of yourself I trusted. You were killing every good memory we ever had. David's voice cracked. I know, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I needed to say it, all of it. I needed you to know the truth, because you deserve that much. She stared at him, studying the man she once loved, the man she married, the man who had held their babies, made her laugh in college, danced with her in the kitchen during snowstorms. He was still there, but buried under years of lies and cowardice. I loved you, David, she said. I really did. I still love you, he whispered. She stood, walked to the window. Rain dotted the glass. She didn't turn around when she spoke again. But I don't think I love this version of you anymore. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. Not filled with dread, not thick with confusion. This one was clean, final. When she turned back, David was standing. He looked like he wanted to say something else but didn't. Instead, he nodded, quietly walked to the door and left. Emily didn't cry. She just stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by broken trust and quiet freedom. For the first time, she knew the whole truth, and that knowledge didn't destroy her. It set her free. The following week unfolded with a kind of quiet Emily had never known. Not the silence of absence, but the stillness that comes after a storm when the damage is laid bare and nothing is pretending anymore. David didn't come back, not even to get the rest of his things. He sent a message 2 days later, asking if she wanted him to pack everything or leave it for her to sort. She replied with a simple, "Take only what's yours." She didn't need a dramatic goodbye. She already had it. The kids came home on Thursday evening. They'd had a good time. Emily could tell by the way Grace had new braids in her hair, and Mason came back with chocolate on his shirt. But their questions started before bedtime. "Is Dad coming home soon?" Emily crouched down and looked them both in the eye. "No," she said softly. "He's not." Mason frowned. Grace clutched her favorite stuffed bunny. "Did he do something bad?" Grace whispered. Emily paused, then answered as honestly as she could for a child. "He made some choices that hurt our family, and now he needs time to fix himself." The kids didn't cry. They didn't scream. They just nodded, like maybe they already knew. Children feel the truth long before they understand it. After tucking them in, Emily returned to her room and sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the quiet space that had once belonged to two people. It wasn't just David who had left. It was the version of her that had spent years compromising, second-guessing, waiting for love to be earned. She wasn't waiting anymore. Healing didn't look like spa days or forgiveness quotes printed on pastel backgrounds. It looked like folding laundry without resentment. It looked like canceling a dinner with fake friends and reading in the bathtub instead. It looked like saying no when she didn't feel ready and yes when she wanted joy without guilt. It also looked like crying at midnight when the house was still, missing the man she used to love, even if that man no longer existed. One evening, Emily called her sister, Amanda, who had always been the bold one, the truth teller. "I keep thinking I should be angrier than I am," Emily confessed, "but I'm mostly tired." "That's grief," Amanda said gently, "not just for the marriage, but for the years you lost believing things would change." Emily wiped a tear from her cheek. "And now you build something new, with what's left, with what's real." That night, Emily wrote in a journal for the first time in years. She didn't write about David or Claire. She wrote about herself, about the girl she used to be, the woman she had become, and the version of her that was still waiting on the other side of the healing. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew this much. She would not disappear to make someone else feel whole again. She would not shrink herself to be chosen. She was done surviving. It was time to live. A month passed. The house no longer echoed with uncertainty. There were still shadows, memories that clung to the edges of doors, in the corners of the bedroom. But Emily had made peace with them. She didn't try to chase them out anymore. She let them live, but she no longer let them rule. One Saturday morning, while folding Mason's T-ball uniform, her phone buzzed. It was David. Just a short message. "I left something for you in the mailbox. I won't bother you again." She hesitated before walking out. The sun was warm on her skin, and a breeze tugged gently at her sleeves. For a moment she considered ignoring it, but something in her, maybe curiosity, maybe closure, moved her forward. Inside the mailbox was a single envelope, no name, just her address scribbled in familiar handwriting. She carried it inside, sat at the kitchen table, and opened it. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. Not the kind that begged for a second chance. It was a confession written with surprising humility. David wrote about his own father's silence, about the kind of man he had promised never to become, and how slowly, without even noticing, he had turned into him. He talked about how, in trying to avoid feeling small, he made others feel invisible, how he hurt her not because she wasn't enough, but because she was, and that terrified him. He ended the letter with one final line: "You were always the light. I just never knew how to stand in it without casting a shadow." Emily didn't cry. She folded the letter, slipped it into her old wedding album, then closed the book. Not out of nostalgia, but because the chapter was complete. 2 days later, she met a friend from college for coffee. A man, just a friend. He didn't ask about David. He asked about her, how she was, what she'd been reading, what dreams she'd left waiting on the shelf. And for the first time in years, she talked without editing herself, without watching her words for how they might be twisted or diminished. She laughed freely. That night, after putting the kids to bed, she stepped out onto the porch. The wind smelled like summer, like freedom, and she whispered a goodbye, not to David, not to the life they shared, but to the version of herself who once thought love meant sacrifice, that loyalty meant silence, that survival meant staying. She was no longer her. She was something stronger, softer, wiser, and though her heart still carried bruises, it beat with certainty. This was not the end of something broken. This was the beginning of something whole.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.